Welcome to the broadcast. We have serious matters to discuss today, some grave matters, although they are rather satisfying because a spotlight has been thrown on both Prince Harry and Scobie. New information has been revealed, new letters have been revealed that we will look over that seem to suggest that the shaping of the narrative from both of those so-called gentlemen over the last few years has been nothing more than crafty wickedness. So we will be looking over those items. But first of all, let's turn to something a little bit more life-enhancing in the form of the Princess of Wales and her carol service together at Christmas. First of all, we were treated to this teaser and I absolutely fell in love. I just think this is one of the best cardigans ever, isn't it? This beautiful, embellished sequin tweed number by Self-Portrait, with pearl studs to the earlobe. That set the tone. It was going to be whites and ivories and creams. Beautiful. And then last night came the carol service itself, to be televised on Christmas Eve. Their Majesties were unable to attend on this occasion because they had prior engagements, but there were lots of family in attendance, including Catherine's parents and her sister Pippa, of course, and husband, and Sarah Chatto, delicious like a cream and brandy gatto. Yes, the Chattos were in attendance. I loved them. Catherine was robed in snowy white. Like a kiss under moonlit mistletoe, she escorted a very smart and grown-up Prince George and Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis in some very funky footwear into Westminster Abbey. The coat was a bespoke number by Chris Kerr, and to the earlobe she wore beautiful Mother of Pearl by Van Cleef & Arpels. I expect she's been taking some inspiration from Queen Camilla. The handbag was by Strathbury. The children stopped off at a cheery red pillar box to post their letters, and it seems that young Prince George was writing to Tony. Remember our young friend that's become acquainted with the Princess of Wales? The Mapley-Motsies followed suit and made quite a stir with a cameo from young Wolfie. Yes, young little Christopher Wolfe is coming along and looked very excited with his stepmother at his side, Princess Beatrice, who was festive in green and blue tartan by Bula. It complemented her red mane of hair wonderfully, I thought. It was stylishly curled into luscious waves for her darling Edo to nuzzle into after carriages. Princess Eugenie was dressed in black sparkles and a burgundy bag. It actually suited her, I thought, very well. I liked the cut, and perhaps wearing the long sleeves over the wrist is the way to go, so that her arms don't look quite so short. Celebrities and stars of the season pulled out all the stops. Oh, Mr. Lambert, perhaps the King would do well to borrow your platforms when he's being photographed next to Big Willie. What do you reckon? Well, it was a luscious spectrum of colours, wasn't it? Christmassy reds and greens. Delicious. I didn't catch sight of my favourite, Princess Michael of Kent, but I did see Prince Michael, looking very sexy, with the divine Ella, but their dear Freddie rolled up with dear Sophie and the bairns, so all was not lost, as did Dickie and Birgitta Gloucester, our smart and immaculate Duke and Duchess. And can we all take a moment to recognise how Catherine is swanning, if that is not some kind of vulgarism? She is swanning along, graceful and elegant. You've seen how hectic her schedule has been for many years, but you see what she does day to day, and she turns up again and again and again and again and again ad infinitum. Utterly serene, totally professional, and absolutely gorgeous. I hate her. The Prince of Wales read verses from the Bible, and our golden trophy, Duchess Sophie, was seated next to our future Queen. She wore a pale blue coat, beautiful, by Susanna. What cheek they've got turning up together and being sat beside each other, those two racists. On the one hand you have Catherine, who was accused of racism on Oprah Wintry, and then you have Sophie, who was accused of casual bigotry towards Oprah by Scobie, because she said Oprah who? Well, on this occasion it's Omid who? Harry who? The service was led by the Dean of Westminster, and the congregation was made up of midwives, health visitors, nursery teachers and volunteers who have gone above and beyond to help others throughout the year. And this is put on in collaboration with Catherine's Early Childhood Foundation. All very thoughtfully curated, and Zara was plum divine in a purple coat by Claire Mischievani Finola. Mischievani? I digress. Claire Mischievani Finola. And the pumps were in burgundy velvet. The black and red ombre crocodile clutch was Aspinall. This is the third rendition of Together at Christmas. Let's compare Catherine's looks from the last 3 years. In 2021, it was a bright red. In 22, it was a darker red, wine burgundy sort of shade. And then this year, ivory. And for the first time, she wore trousers, which is rather practical because, as you might have noticed, she spends an awful lot of time bending down and crouching down to speak with her husband's future subjects. But William wasn't the only handsome member of the royal family in attendance, because we had the vision of our wonderfully cosy big armchair in the shape of Peter Phillips. Oh, he's divine. Oh, how he'd love to bounce on that comfy lap of his, those muscular rugby thighs. So warm and welcoming, like a well-worn oxblood leather armchair, antique, with a wee dram or two of Christmas cognac on the side. Oh, I do digress. Lucky Lindsay, lucky Lindsay. And there's dear Savannah and Isla. But it is now time to turn to more rum characters. Rum characters like Omid Scobie, who wrote an article for iNews, which bizarrely seems to abnegate himself of all culpability for his actions while simultaneously admitting it. Yes, you couldn't make it up. He starts with the usual nonsense, droning on about how the endgame backlash shows how unwilling we are to confront race issues. Maybe it's because they're shoved down our throat every hour of every day. He says the royal institution's failure to protect its only family member of colour sends a clear message. Well, I shall read out the highlight, the most duplicitous passage of this article to you. He says, "To be clear, the only publisher I worked directly with was the one covering the US and UK. I spent almost 2 months with independent British barristers and in-house legal counsel to ensure that every detail in the finished book was legally watertight. Unbeknownst to me at the time. Early and uncleared text was provided to the Dutch publisher in order for them to start work on the translation, with the understanding that their translation would be updated to reflect the final version of the book I officially submitted." And I should mention at this point that everyone keeps harping on about how Piers Morgan revealed that it was Charles and Catherine that Omid was referring to, that he was the one that presented it to the public. Well, I would rather like to say that actually in my broadcast, which went out on the same evening and in the same hour, I told you the same thing. I told you that it was Catherine and Charles, and it was possibly even before Piers Morgan. It was certainly within the same hour and recorded several hours before. So he wasn't the only one delivering that news to the world, and I'm sure that quite a few of you had heard the same thing. So he's getting a bit too much credit there, to be honest, my dear, because the world doesn't revolve around simply mainstream media news channels anymore, or the biggies, because lots of us are already onto it, aren't we, my dear, and what's going on behind the scenes. So I will put that in for what it's worth. I was also very clear out of the gates that it was my understanding that this was deliberate in some format rather than a simple error, or two names that had been plucked out of the sky and out of the blue. And I also told you to look around his words when it comes to his television interviews, and that I wasn't happy with some of the interviewers because even when they probed him, they would accept the answer he gave and not look at what he was saying, but what he was not saying. There is a reason that one might be asked in court not only to tell the truth. That doesn't suffice, my dear. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So at a snail's pace, we begin chipping away at the edges, and the full picture begins to emerge, doesn't it, my dears? Scobie says, "I always knew releasing my second royal book was going to be a steep uphill climb. Like your career, you climber, just like Meghan, a climber, and an unsuccessful one at that, because what Camilla Tominey and many other journalists have mentioned is that Scobie was buzzing around trying to become a member of the Royal Rota and one of the royal go-tos and formulate his career, but was considered rather mediocre and wasn't making the kind of contacts and connections that he really wished to make. And that is why he had to turn and ally himself with other forces and other factions, if you will. But rather than a steep uphill climb, as you put it, Mr. Scobie, your book release seems to have been a steep slide, a descent into the pits of hell. He whinges and wails and moans on about his book not receiving objective coverage by the press. Grow up. That's the industry you are in, my dear. You are a hack, and you can either embrace that with pride or try to reject it as if you are something above. He bangs on about not being able to discuss uncomfortable history, as if he knows anything about history, actual history. These people all engineer their own versions of history with no foot in the truth. Uncomfortable history regarding prejudice and imperial might around the royal establishment. Maybe because we are living in 2023, not 1723. Then he claims the identities of those who took part in these conversations were to remain a mystery. So why did you write them down in the first place, lovey? I was in the middle of TV interviews in New York when a single name surfaced on social media after it was published in the Dutch edition. My stomach flipped. Oh, my stomach flipped, and I shat myself. Oh, poor Omid. Poor Mr. Scobie. He shat himself. The 403 pages that I had carefully written. That's your idea of care, taking time and thoughtfulness over your shitty tone. I had carefully written, edited and signed off to the printers, made it very clear that any names would not be revealed due to legal reasons. What are these legal reasons, Mr. Scobie? That's what I want to know. What are the legal reasons anyway? Why are you so afraid? Why did your lawyers send you running and say, oh no, you don't want to put that, my dear? Because if you have been told this information by a source with true insight, that you feel confident enough to lay it down in writing at some point in its writing, then it must have emanated from the King or the Duchess of Sussex, mustn't it? Or perhaps the Duke of Sussex, if you wanted to push it. But it must have come from one of those parties. So, if you were to have gone on and published an accusation from a solid source, who exactly are you afraid of libeling? The accused or the accuser? Who is going to sue you? Why are you worried about that? And on what grounds are they going to sue you? Would it leave you vulnerable to litigation, or would it leave your informant vulnerable to litigation? What exactly made your stomach flip, Mr. Scobie? You must have originally wanted to include it before you ran it past all your lawyers and they did all these checks. So why exactly did legal run so scared? After his stomach did a flip, then the publisher from the Netherlands announced that there had been an error, Mr. Scobie says. And then a second name came in. And he was busy with TV interviews, he tells us. And he still didn't have the full story, so he was stuck. He was stuck, and he's full of outrage for all the press attention and all the accusations that it was a big PR stunt. Stop fannying about as if you are a deer caught in the headlights and as if you are polishing your halo, minding your own business, not casting aspersions upon innocents such as Sophie and Catherine and Charles and every member of the royal family, simply to suit your demographic and those few hundred who might have sent a few sales your way. And he goes on. And herein lies the problem. Time and time again I encounter this aggressive resistance to allowing proper discourse about the current state and role of the British monarchy to take place. Whoa, ladies and gentlemen, my dear fruit crumbles, please get on your knees and bow down. We have a great philosopher, a great mind, and a great pen, a great bard in our presence, Mr. Omid Scobie. Move over Jean-Paul Sartre, move over Karl Marx, move over Shakespeare, move over Descartes, move over Aristotle. We have a great profound thinker of our time. He's even brighter than Prince Harry, which is very hard to do because he is the intellect that all of us must survey. Move over. Ha! Well, Rick Evers is not going to bow over. Rick Evers, or Rick Evers, the Dutch correspondent who uncovered this error in translation, because he passed on a message, as did the Daily Mail. Actually, I think it came from the Mail. They passed on a comment from the publisher, a bloke called Zander, who said Omid Scobie's explanation in his column in iNews about the Dutch editorial process at the Dutch edition of Endgame is factually incorrect, and we do not recognise ourselves in his representation of the events. How very intriguing. Oh, I wish I had a magnifying glass to do my Agatha Christie. How very intriguing. The Dutch are no nonsense. The Dutch don't have a particular obsession with defending English royals either, my dear. They are matter of fact, very down to earth, not easily or happily coaxed into drama of any kind. So they have no skin in anyone's particular game, but they will defend themselves if besmirched, and it seems that they are not backwards and forwards in piping up. And they have offered this rebuttal to Mr. Scobie's words, so I look very much forward to seeing how that progresses and seeing what else might come forward. But what I will say is that even if Omid Scobie submitted an early version for translation, and that is where the names appeared, Charles and Catherine, is that not a gross dereliction of care? Not to take the time, if he wasn't absolutely sure that it was legally watertight, for him to put those names in that book, if he wasn't absolutely sure that that is what he wanted to put in there, what he believed to be true, and that he was happy to be published. Is it not a complete dereliction of duty and of care to actually allow those names to be out among translators, administration staff, who knows which other languages it might have appeared in, I don't know, but sent all over the world, those names, with the possibility that they might have then been withdrawn at some point? Did he not think, even if he was simply providing it to the very closest intimates of his UK and US publishers, even then, did he not think that it might have been part of his duty of care to himself as well as to members of the royal family and his informers to keep that private until he was absolutely sure that the names could go ahead and be published? Well, you know what they say, my dear. Every dog knows their own. Every dog knows their own. And watch 'em as they sniff each other's arseholes. Sniffing away and behaving as if they are in clover, as if they are high on Bluebell by Penhaligons, or First by Van Cleef & Arpels, Diana's favourite. Well, all I can smell is the whiff of bullshit. Prince Harry's mischief-making has also been exposed in new letters. But before we go on to that, I think we should have a little palate cleanser, don't you, my dear? A little moment of royal refreshment. And we will do so here with Queen Camilla, who opened Winter Flowers Week at the Garden Museum in Lambeth. Children adorned her with a handmade crown of flowers and a toy dinosaur. There were imaginative floral installations on display. It was a really lovely event, and the Queen was wonderful. And the King, meanwhile, met with Father Christmas and elves in Ealing. Did you hear about the lady from Ealing in the Irish limerick? There was a young lady from Ealing. She had a peculiar feeling. She laid on her back, opened her crack, and peed all over the ceiling. I digress. And Father Christmas told His Majesty that he was at the very top of his good list. Don't tell the Harkles. This was an unannounced appearance, and so the crowds were even more enraptured than usual. They were in shock, falling over themselves to meet with the King, to try and shake his hand, to try and catch a glimpse of royalty. The King watched a dance performance by Impact Theatre Group, who support adults with learning difficulties. And he had a rummage through the Christmas market, full of cheer it was, with local business owners and artisans, and the king very much enjoyed his conversation with these welcoming people. And now we turn to the subject of Harry, the horse of a different safari. Do you remember in Spare when he smited 3 of the late Queen's advisers at the palace as his enemies, including Sir Edward Young, who he characterised as a B character? This was really a concoction of J.R. Moore and the art of memoir. You know, he wanted to cast these 3 as insects, parasites, and comical figures, and he characterised Sir Edward Young. And let's remember at this time that the late Queen was living and breathing, and Harry, for all he knew, still would be at the time this was published, and he had the rudeness, he had the rude temerity to be intending to publish it while she still lived and breathed. Well, a letter has emerged from Sir Edward Young, the late Queen's most senior aide, her personal secretary. A letter from him to Sir Mark Sedwill, who was Cabinet Secretary in 2020, after the Sandringham Agreement, just after it. Yes, this letter has emerged, and it appears to fly in the face of absolutely everything that you and I have been told by Harry. Sir Edward was writing to the Cabinet Secretary to explain what had been decided between Queen Elizabeth and Harry about his security arrangements, after he agreed that he would not be publicly styled HRH and would not continue working in the same capacity for the Queen, which was prior to the airing of the Oprah interview. Relations were at least cordial and not as frosty as they were later to become. Newly published court documents reveal how Sir Edward, in his role as Private Secretary, told a Home Office committee that ensuring the Duke and Duchess of Sussex remain safe is of paramount importance to Her Majesty and her family. There it is in black and white. So don't start accusing these documents of unconscious bias or white supremacy, Harry, because they appear in black and white. They're biracial. In Spare, Harry described Sir Edward Young as oval-faced and fuzzy. He tended to glide around with great equanimity and poise, as if he was a boon to all living things. Well, you could have mistaken that for Harry's own eulogy, couldn't you, my dears? Talk about projection. We know who's the fuzzy one, don't we, my dear? The fuzzy end of the lollipop. And I don't call him the dandelion affair for nothing. He was described by Harry and J.R. Moore as one of the 3 middle-aged white men who'd managed to consolidate power by a series of bold Machiavellian manoeuvres. So Harry was also telling us here that his granny was duped and gullible and so stupid as head of state that these great Machiavellian movers and shakers who she'd never seen before, never seen the likes of these interlopers in her 70-year reign and beyond. Harry had to come to the rescue. Well, he says that Harry was blocked from seeing Granny by the likes of Sir Edward Young. And he says, to hell with the B. Who was he to try and block me? What seems to be apparent now is that Sir Edward was actually making the case for Harry's effective security as they departed from royal life. He was making the case for it. And if you're confused as to why this letter has come to light this week, it's been submitted as evidence to ascertain the truth of whether Harry made an offer to pay for his own security and when, because he claims that he made an offer during the Sandringham Agreement, the Sandy Summit, if you will. But Ravec rejects this. Ravec, which is a committee within the Home Office that deals with security for royals and VIPs, they reject this claim and say they did not receive any such offer at that stage from Harry. And Harry is bringing this legal action against the Home Office over the February 2020 decision of Ravec, which was a decision not to fund his security. And so it is the government who are opposing Harry in this case, saying that Harry was treated in a bespoke manner, with his security provision considered by Ravec in appropriate circumstances, a case-by-case basis, if you will. Harry's barrister claims that Ravek chose not to follow its own written policy of a risk analysis. This is what Harry keeps harping on about, that they had a written policy with a risk analysis, but they cast it aside when it came to me, and chose a far inferior procedure, deviating in such a way for the first time. That is what Harry is accusing them of. And of course, you might remember that Prince Harry became enraged when he discovered that Sir Edward was on the committee for Ravek. I believe the committee is made up of about 10 different members. 2 or 3 of them do have an association, a tie, or are under employment from the palace. And traditionally it was unknown or mystery who was actually on this committee until a Freedom of Information request was made. And that was when it was discovered that Sir Edward was on the committee, and Harry became absolutely enraged because he saw him as an arch nemesis and didn't know that he was involved in the decision-making process. Well, there is criticism for some quarters for the fact that people linked to the palace or working for the palace are on that committee. But let's remember, it only makes up about 30% of the members on that committee. The 70% of other members are from other factions, and when you come together as a committee to make decisions about the royal family and various VIPs, then you do require input from those who are dealing with members of the royal family and understand the implications. I'm going to read out the various sections of this letter, because this is important stuff that has come to light. On the subject of security, you will understand well that ensuring the Duke and Duchess of Sussex remain safe is of paramount importance to Her Majesty and the family. Given the Duke's public profile by virtue of being born into the royal family, his military service, the Duchess's own independent profile, and the well-documented history of targeting of the Sussex family by extremists, it is imperative that the family continues to be provided with effective security. And of course, the family is mindful of tragic incidents of the past. The discussions to date have been useful in making sure that the parameters of the Ravek process are well understood. Of course, Her Majesty and family recognise that these are independent processes, and decisions about the provision of publicly funded security are for the UK government, the government of Canada, and any other host government. On the subject of location and activity, during their time in the UK, the Duke and Duchess expect to attend public-facing engagements representing the charities and causes which remain dear to them. These engagements would no longer be formally undertaken on behalf of Her Majesty, but given the profile of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, we would expect they would still attract public attention. In regard to their Commonwealth patronages, although the Duke and Duchess of Sussex will not be formally representing Her Majesty, they will be undertaking work that is closely associated with Her Majesty and which may appear to the public eye to be very similar to now. Of course, a number of these patronages have been granted to them by Her Majesty and which they will continue actively to fulfil. Her Majesty may from time to time invite the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to attend national royal occasions in their private capacity, and Her Majesty is likely to invite the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to participate in family events in keeping with other non-working members of the family. Do these sound like the words of some Machiavellian entity? Call me naive, but it sounds very much as if Sir Edward Young was fighting to keep the Duke and Duchess of Sussex safe on Her late Majesty's behalf. That is exactly what the Queen wanted. That is exactly what Sir Edward Young wanted and was asking for. In Spare, Harry was speaking of his great fear and his great distress at that time, and he was describing the palace's obligation and implicit promise to continue with their security. Well, it seems as if they made every effort to do so at this particular time period. I'm not talking about in the future or at any other time. This time frame. Harry said the institution was wearing me down. Harry told us that out of all the various proposals, the scenarios presented to him by the palace for his consideration, he says the leading proposal called for total abandonment. They've abandoned me. No, my dear, no. This is the way that he processes information. Do you see why they make a match made in hell, that pair, that duo? Folie à deux. And Harry said that ultimately those present at the meeting reluctantly agreed to continue a year trial period retaining security. Oh, so reluctant. Well, it doesn't sound like it, does it? The fact of the matter remains that it was not the royal family's decision. It was Ravek's decision, an independent committee. Curiouser and curiouser, isn't it, my dears, when you take a little peek through the looking glass? Well, we are not going to be satisfied with Meghan's truth or Harry's truth, are we, my dears? We are not going to settle for anything other than the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help us God. We are Alice in a royal wonderland, trying to make our way through the mazes and labyrinths of surprise, at every twist and turn encountering the Mad Hatter and the Queen of Tarts. Well, we're not convinced by them and their mischief. They can pull as many white rabbits out of the hat as they want, with their tricksy goings-on, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, but we see through it. The mirror cracked from side to side, we look down, the world opens wide, from Camelot to Windsor, quick, ta-ra, my dears, and toodle pip.